Hey, this is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 104 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to look at some of the most significant things research can tell us about note-taking. Okay, let's talk about note-taking. Every day in classrooms all over the world, students are taking notes. I have my own half-baked ideas about what makes one approach better than another, and I'm sure you do too. But if we're going to call ourselves professionals, we need to know what the research says, yes? So, I have combed through about 3 decades worth of research, and I'm going to tell you what it says about best practices in note-taking. Although this is not an exhaustive summary, it hits on some of the most frequently debated questions on the subject. Before we get started, I would like to thank you for the reviews you've left for the podcast on iTunes. If you've been listening and you've never left a review, but you think other people would like the show, take a few minutes to go over to iTunes and leave a rating and a review. Thank you so much. Support for today's show comes from PeerGrade. PeerGrade is a platform that makes it easy to facilitate peer review in your classroom. Students review each other's work, while PeerGrade takes care of anonymously assigning reviewers and delivering all the relevant insights to teachers. With PeerGrade, students learn to think critically and take ownership of their learning. They also learn to write kind and useful feedback for their peers. PeerGrade is free to use for teachers and students. To learn more, visit cultofpedagogy.com/peergrade. Support also comes from 3Doodler. The 3Doodler is a really neat tool. It works just like a 3D printer, except the printing comes out of a pen. With the 3Doodler, students can create, design, and build, transforming abstract concepts into physical models, making those concepts easier to understand. 3Doodler EDU learning packs were designed with teachers, so they truly encompass the needs of classrooms at any grade level. With 3D pens, accessories, lesson plans, and more all packed into one kit, you're ready to start learning as soon as you open the box. As a Cult of Pedagogy listener, you can try your first 3Doodler learning pack with a special 10% discount by visiting cultofpedagogy.com/3doodler. That's 3DOODLER. The Cult of Pedagogy podcast is part of the Education Podcast Network. The EPN family now includes 25 different podcasts, and each one of them has something to do with education. There's stuff on ed tech, on leadership, on motivation, and there's even a few that are devoted to specific subject areas. You can find this podcast and all the other EPN shows at edupodcastnetwork.com. Now, note-taking. The information I'm going to share is going to be useful for any subject area. I found some really good stuff that would be especially useful for STEM teachers or anybody who does heavy work with calculations, diagrams, and other technical illustrations. So everyone sit tight because you'll probably come away with something you can apply to your classroom. The first thing we need to address before we start talking about the note-taking research is the concept of lectures. When we think about note-taking, it's natural to assume a context of lecture-based lessons. And that is one common scenario when a student is likely to take notes. But other learning experiences also lend themselves to note-taking. Watching videos in a flipped or blended environment, reading assigned textbook chapters or handouts, doing research for a project, and even going on field trips can all be opportunities for taking notes. So instead of referring to lectures in this overview, I'll just talk about learning experiences or intake sessions, times when students are absorbing content or skills through some sort of medium, as opposed to purely applying that content or synthesizing it into some kind of product. Even in student-centered, project-driven classrooms, where students pursue their own authentic tasks, like the Apollo School, which we featured in episode 62. If you haven't listened to that one, you really need to, because that school is so cool. Or even in more traditional classrooms that set aside time for things like Genius Hour projects, which, by the way, we covered in episode 55. In any of these situations that are not heavily lecture-based, students still need to gather, encode, and store information. So note-taking would still be a fit. So I just wanted to add that in case you saw the topic of note-taking and thought, no, I'm a really progressive teacher. I don't do any traditional styles of teaching. I think good note-taking skills really can still be very relevant in all of those situations. Okay, so I have got 8 takeaways for you based on the research that I've been looking at about what the research tells us about note-taking. So, number 1 is note-taking matters. Whether it is taking notes from lectures or from reading, note-taking has been shown to improve student learning. In other words, if we want our students to remember more of what they learned in our classes, it is better to have them take notes than it is to not have them take notes. The thinking behind this is that note-taking requires effort. Rather than passively taking information in, the act of encoding the information into words or pictures forms new pathways in the brain, which stores it more firmly in long-term memory. On top of that, having that information stored in a new place gives students the opportunity to revisit it later and reinforce the learning that happened the first time around. So, if you are not currently having students take notes in your class, consider adding note-taking to your regular classroom routine. With that said, a number of other factors can influence the potency of a student's note-taking, and that is what the other points are going to address. So takeaway number 2, more is better. Although students are often encouraged to keep notes brief, it turns out that in general, the more notes students take, the more information they tend to remember later. The quantity of notes is directly related to how much information students retain. This would be useful information to share with students. If they know that more complete notes will result in better learning, they may be more likely to record additional information in their notes rather than striving for brevity. Obviously, some students are going to be faster note takers than others, and this will allow them to take more complete notes. But you can do quite a bit to help all students get more information into their notes, regardless of their natural speed, and that is what we'll talk about next. So before I move on to point number 3, I just wanted to pause and let you know that every time I say studies show or research shows, what I'm skipping over in this audio version is all of the references to the specific studies, all the stuff that's in parentheses at the end of these sentences with the names of the researchers and the dates. If you go over to Cult of Pedagogy, click on podcast and go to episode 104, it'll be taking you to a blog post that has all the research that I mentioned. And I've got maybe a dozen different studies that I cite here. So you can either just take all this information and just run with it and trust me, or you can come back and reference it, especially if you're going to be changing your practice based on some of the stuff you're hearing. You may want to actually go and look at the studies that I'm referencing. So with that said, let's move on to number 3. Explicitly teaching note-taking strategies can make a difference. Although some students seem to have an intuitive sense for what notes to record, for everyone else, getting trained in specific note-taking strategies can significantly improve the quality of notes and the amount of material they remember later. This is especially true for students with learning disabilities. So there are a lot of different note-taking systems, but one frequently used note-taking system is Cornell Notes. And in the blog post, I've got a link to an article that really simply explains how this works. Cornell Notes has been around for decades, and it provides a really simple way to take live notes in class and condense and review them later. So that's one option. We're going to talk about a couple of others, though. So quickly, the first 3 points that we are taking away from the research is that note-taking matters. In other words, doing it is better than not doing it at all. Number 2 is more is better. So the more notes students take on a topic, the more they're going to remember later. And number 3, explicitly teaching note-taking strategies can make a difference in terms of the quality. So it's really helpful to teach kids how to take notes than to just say, take notes. Okay, number 4, adding visuals boosts the power of notes. Compared with writing alone, adding drawings to represent concepts, terms, and relationships has a significant effect on memory and learning. Now, the growing popularity of sketchnoting in recent years suggests that teachers are well on their way to taking advantage of this research. So over on the post, what I've got are a couple of resources that can help you learn more about this. One is a list of sketchnoting resources that was shared with me by Sylvia Duckworth, who does lots and lots of really cool education-related sketch notes. She's sort of known for her sketchnoting. And that's just a list of a lot of different things. It's a list of, well-known sketchnoters and some research and some tutorials. So that's a good one to go and take a look at. And I'm also going to be including a video that I absolutely loved. The video was created by a guy named Doug Neal, who has a website called Verbal to Visual, and he's got a ton of really good sketchnote videos. This particular video, though, I really liked because he is showing how to combine Cornell notes with sketchnoting, which I think is a genius matchup. And it's a long video. I think it's like 11 minutes or something, but it's good. It's really good. So come over and see that too. Okay, so that's about visuals, adding any kind of visuals. It doesn't even have to be, sketchnoting, which is kind of, it could be intimidating, I guess, to somebody who doesn't consider themselves an artist. But even just adding little doodles on the sides of things that have something to do with the topic can really help to solidify our memory on certain topics. Okay, number 5. This one has a lot to it, okay? And I think it's one of the newest things for me out of all the research that I learned. Revision, collaboration, and pausing boosts the power of notes. When students are given the opportunity to revise, add to, or rewrite their notes, they tend to retain more information. And when that revision happens during deliberate pauses in a lecture or other learning experience, students remember the information better and take better notes than if the revision happens after the learning experience is over. So in other words, it's good to revise your notes. It's even better to revise them during the actual learning experience. If you can have pauses built in to do that, that's going to be even better. And finally, if students collaborate on this revision with partners, they record even more complete notes and score higher on post-tests. So, with this in mind, it would be a good idea to plan breaks in your learning experiences to allow students to look over, add to, and revise their notes, ideally with a partner or a small group. This partner work could happen after students have had time to revise their notes alone, or students might be given access to classmates for the duration of the pause, however you want to do it. Again, I would say experiment. Okay, so that was number 5. Number 6, scaffolding increases retention. Teachers can build scaffolds into their instruction to ensure that students take better notes. One very effective type of scaffold is guided notes, which are also called skeleton or skeletal notes. With guided notes, the instructor provides some type of outline of the material to be covered, but with space left for students to complete key information. This strategy has been shown to substantially increase student achievement across all grade levels. This is elementary through college, and with students who present with various disabilities. So, in other words, providing pre-completed notes or partially completed notes is a really, really good strategy. As instructors experiment with guided notes, certain features show a lot of promise. One system that I found incredibly interesting was a style developed by engineering professor Susan Reynolds, who works at the Colorado School of Mines, to accompany her lectures. Her notes combine typed information, handwritten content, and graphics, but still leave room for student notes and working out example problems. Her diagrams are pre-drawn, but then some key numbers are left out for students to fill in during the lecture. These notes consolidate all the technical material for a lecture into a single document, and the information is organized to align with the lecture. The more I study these particular notes, the more I see how useful they are and how well they balance the efficiency offered by guided notes with the need for students to actively participate in the encoding. Reynolds students have had strong positive reactions to this style of notes, and they consistently attribute the notes as a key factor in their engagement and learning in the course. I can't do these notes justice just by talking about it here. You really need to see them, and I've got a couple of screenshots in the blog post that show them. she's just really iterated this over a couple of years, it looks like, to really get it down. And one of the things I think is so great is that she'll have diagrams in there, but they're missing certain elements. So the students really have to be paying attention. And she fills them out during her lecture. So students know exactly where to put certain things, and they can see where to add information and numbers. And there's also opportunities there to work out example problems. I really, really would advise you to go and look at it, especially if you teach a somewhat technical subject. They're just really unique. And she just presented this at a conference in 2016. So I have a feeling we're going to be seeing more and more visual note-taking styles emerge. But this is one that I think is worth some time to take a look at. So the takeaway here is that if you want students to get the most out of a learning experience, provide them with some form of partially completed notes. So we're still on number 6. We're talking about scaffolding. Another kind of scaffolding that you can add is to simply add more verbal cues to your learning experiences. Research shows that simply saying things like, "This is an important point," or "Be sure to add this to your notes," can ensure that students include key ideas in their notes. Providing written cues on the board or on a slideshow can also help students structure their notes and decide what information to include. So the thing that I got out of this, and a lot of this is kind of like duh, but it's sort of helpful to know that people have studied this and have sort of measured the difference between when we help our students out a little bit and when we don't. Because I think sometimes teachers can get a little bit, we can kind of dig our heels in and say, look, they need to figure it out, and we're going to leave them to their own devices. Or a lot of times we just assume, especially if we teach older kids, that they just know how to take notes. And so I think we leave a lot of kids flapping in the wind when we do that. So even for college level students, it's helpful to teach note-taking strategies and to provide some scaffolding. All right, here's number 7. And this is the one that I really was surprised by because I've actually written the opposite of this in the past. So number 7 is providing instructor notes improves learning. So in an article I wrote a few years ago called 5 Teaching Practices I'm Kicking to the Curb, this was episode 24, I denounced instructor-prepared notes as an ineffective method for teaching, primarily because encoding this information required no effort from students and therefore made the learning too passive. Although I stand by the assertion that we should avoid simply supplying students with notes, I need to refine the message now that I've read more research. Research has shown that when we give students complete, well-written, instructor-prepared notes to review after they take their own notes, they learn significantly more than with their own notes alone. So the study that I reference looked at students who just had their own notes, students who just had instructor-prepared notes and didn't take their own notes, and then students who did both. The students who took only their own notes did the worst in terms of sort of post-lesson performance. The students who looked at the instructor-prepared notes did better, and the students who did both did the best. So that's important because I think there still is a lot of value in students attempting to encode what they're learning into their own notes first, as opposed to just receiving it. And it's such a common practice now to just provide notes to students after lectures and other learning experiences. And I do think that it's an important distinction that effort should be made by the students to take their own notes first, not because we just want them to work harder, but because it actually helps them to learn better. So if we combine this strategy of instructor-provided notes with some of the other stuff that we've just talked about, revision, collaboration, pausing to improve note-taking and learning. In other words, if we have students pause during an intake session to collaboratively revise their notes and then let them review instructor notes at the end, we can give our students an incredibly powerful learning experience. So before we move on to number 8, I want to address some concerns that you might have, that I have too, about providing instructor notes. One concern is that this might make students more passive about taking their notes during the learning experience. It might make them just say, well, whatever, we're going to get the notes at the end, so I'm not going to try, or I'm going to just pretend to take notes, or I'm just not going to do it at all. So here are some thoughts about how to address that. One idea is you could assign a small grade for student notes. This would likely compel most students to do them just for the grade, but this could distort the validity of their overall course grade. And I talked about this quite a bit in episode 94, how accurate are your grades? The idea being that if we give points for things like attendance and attitude and effort and even homework practice, it can mess up the validity of the grade because it's not really measuring their learning, it's measuring their habits more than anything. So that's probably, in my opinion, not the best option for getting students to take their own notes during class. I think it would probably be more effective to simply build note-taking into your class activities. So for example, if students are encouraged to take notes, and then they're given a pause every few minutes to compare and revise notes with each other, it would be pretty awkward for a student to have to turn to a partner and have nothing to contribute. For some kids, that still wouldn't motivate them, but I think it would get a lot more students on board if this is sort of just part of your class culture. Also, sharing this research with students, that those who take their own notes and then revise them with instructor notes have more success than people who just use instructor notes alone. This research might push students to take more notes. I think it's just really valuable to just share educational research with our students. And I think we can do that even with like third graders. We can say to them, people who study this stuff, they've noticed that, if you take your own notes first and then you look at mine, you're actually going to learn better. And finally, before we move on, I think we will get students to take more notes on their own if we allow them to choose a note-taking format that works best for them. I think anytime they're given a choice for things, their motivation is boosted. So those are just some thoughts for how to make them take their own notes. Alrighty, number 8. This is such a hotly debated topic, and this is our last one. Handwritten notes may be more powerful than digital notes, but digital note-taking can be fine-tuned. Studies have shown that students who take notes by hand learn more than those who take notes on a laptop. This research confirms what a number of educators suspect about the negative effects of digital devices in the classroom. And some have taken it to mean that they should definitely ban laptops from their lectures. Others argue that prohibiting laptop use robs students of the opportunity to develop metacognitive awareness of their own levels of distraction and make the appropriate adjustments. Because technology is always changing, and because as a species we are still adjusting to these new formats, I would hesitate to ban laptops from the classroom. Here's why. First of all, research on this topic is still pretty young. Some researchers have found no significant difference in performance between paper-based and digital note takers. My guess is that more research will pile up and get more refined, so we should take a measured approach for the time being. Other researchers are looking at ways to reduce some of the problems associated with digital note-taking, like distraction, for example. One study found that while doing online research, students who use matrix-style notes, that's where you sort of use like a chart to complete information. So students who use matrix-style notes and are given time limits are much less likely to become distracted by other online material than students without these conditions. So if you've got students doing online research and taking notes, one way to sort of focus them a little bit better is to give them a chart to complete and also give them a time limit. This keeps them from wandering onto other tabs or clicking on other things. Finally, I believe we serve our students better by helping them find a note-taking system that works best for them. With that in mind, I would be more likely to have students experiment with handwritten and digital notes, share the research with them, and give them opportunities to reflect on and measure their results. So, I'm going to review these 8 one more time. Number 1, note-taking matters. Note-taking is better than not note-taking. Number 2, more is better. More notes you take, the more you're going to learn. Number 3, explicitly teaching note-taking strategies can make a difference. Number 4, adding visuals boosts the power of notes. 5, revision, collaboration, and pausing boosts the power of notes. 6, scaffolding increases retention, and that's about having guided notes and giving them verbal cues during a learning experience. 7, providing instructor notes improves learning. And 8, handwritten notes may be more powerful than digital notes, but digital note-taking can be fine-tuned. Now, I've got one more resource for you. To learn more about what other teachers have found to be the most effective note-taking methods, I put the call out on Twitter last week, asking teachers to share what works for them. And I got all kinds of answers. So, in the blog post, if you go to Cult of Pedagogy, click podcast, and go to episode 104, you can find a link that goes straight to where I asked, and you'll be able to see all the responses that I got from people. And some people put pictures up, and some people put links up to their blog posts where they describe their process. And so that is just a really interesting conversation. For links to all the research and resources mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 104. To get a weekly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.